So we're going to take some time to go through Andy Stanley's plan for 1-point preaching. We've talked about this before. We spend a lot of time thinking about the what of what we want to talk about when we're delivering a message, such as in a homily, but sometimes we don't speak or work on as much of the how, and so that's really the focus. There is some focus on the what and how to figure that out, but this is a really a how to take a message and communicate it in a way that will be effective. So as we're working on it right now, we are getting ready for our Advent preaching series, and there is in the Google Drive under preaching series and Advent an overview of the themes for the series. And so we have this theme of a perfect Advent. If you look at the graphics, the perfect is broken and sort of shattered, but then it's this idea of welcoming into our messiness, our imperfection. On the first week, we have a team of priests that are preaching, and then on the second and third Sundays of Advent, we have our team Ignatius and team Xavier, 2 deacons and 2 priests each on that team, and then Father Phil is preaching for the 4th Sunday at all the masses there. So when we look at these are sort of the main points. They need to be refined. So that is when we're talking about 1-point preaching. That's what these questions are starting to get at least, and we'll talk about that. So in this way of preaching or delivering a message, the approach is that we follow is to communicate with the goal of everything we do is with this goal of communicating, and our goal is with homily is some sort of change, it's some sort of conversion and change, so that we really make relevant whatever we're talking about. We make it relevant so that it has some sort of effect on as many of the listeners as possible. The second part is to pick a point. So that's the one thing that you want the audience or the assembly to know or to do. And the idea here is to, as many great possibilities as there are, there's endless great things that we could to communicate or to urge people to do differently, that we want to focus on one and not more than one. So we might end up, and we usually do, coming up with multiple ideas, and one part of the hard part is to figure out what is that one idea that is the most important thing, that one concrete thing that we want to design this homily around and we're going to communicate. When we're looking at the Advent preaching series, these are what these prompts are here for each of the Sundays. They, I think, still need some refining, and so that's some of the work that you will do in your group. So these are good starts, and then you're going to want to work on identifying even more clearly your one point. And the process is that you dig in until you find it. So you really take some time to kind of really hone in on it and make sure it's one idea, not multiple ideas, or one pretty focused thing and not sort of a too generic thing. You build everything around it, and we'll talk about that. But so everything we're going to do is basically driven on communicating this one idea. And then the third thing is to make it stick. So, and Andy Stanley really has this strong idea that we need to come up with a single statement or a phrase that's memorable, that's an anchor that you can come back to over and over again throughout the message or the homily or the talk. If you think back to the message that I delivered about serving in ministry, I used the back in August. I used the phrase that I stole from Audrey Assad's song "Little Things with Great Love," and I repeated it probably 4 or 5 times in a 5-minute homily or talk. I even sang it at the end. I used it as part of a song, and that was something that I kept coming back to. Um, it's good for the audience, but it's also good for you because it's that one thing that you remember that you're focused on, and you say it over and over again. Here are some of Andy Stanley's examples of some of his better ones that he's come up with. They don't have to be too clever. Sometimes they can rhyme even, sometimes not, but they're short and fairly memorable. Like here, admitting weakness is a sign of strength. Purity paves the way to intimacy. I like this. We just had this giving series this last week. This sort of seems like a theme for a giving series or generosity. The value of your life is determined by how much of it you give away. In the book about 1 Point Preaching, that this is all based on, Andy Stanley talks about as an example. I think he shares it in the podcast too, of a gentleman coming up to him who hadn't seen him in 10 or 15 years, came up to him and just in the middle of an event after he heard him speak, and just came up to Andy Stanley and said, "To understand why, submit and apply." And as it turned out, that had been the main idea, the one point that Andy Stanley had used in a talk or a sermon that he'd given at this gentleman's chapel in college, more than 10 years before. And this guy had remembered that, and that phrase, and then that unlocks all the things that were in the talk. That lets you unlock all those things that you had talked about. So coming up with this sort of sticky statement is this first step in figuring out what your point is. Well, it's really the last step in figuring out what your point is. So once you have that, we get into this part where we're going to create a map. And what happens here is this is different of how we often think about constructing a message. We often construct what we're talking about around the topic. So, for instance, a topic might have 3 sort of main sections. So we would outline it so that, the first portion would be take this element. So like if we were talking about the Trinity, for instance, first we would talk about God, then we would talk about Jesus, and then third we would talk about the Holy Spirit, and then we might tie it all together in the end. So that's when when our outline or our plan or our flow is, that's when it's around designing it around the content. Rather, in this method, we're going to design our map for our talk, or our outline for our talk, around our relationship with the audience and how we are relating to the audience and the interaction there. And so that's how we get this plan for easy way to remember: me, we, God, you, we. If you, I want to point out in the here in the preaching and presiding directory under 1 Point Preaching, I've created this homily form document, which I'll show you. And so for all the homilies, when we're planning together, what will be good is to fill each of these sections in. So I have a place here for what you can write your one thing that you want the assembly to know or do. And then for each parts of this map, for instance, the me, the we, which we'll talk about in a second, there's a place in this form for you to fill out. And when you're especially working together, but this is what you can use. And obviously, you're going to have more notes in this, but when you come to decisions, this is where you can record that. And then this is a way also for when as you're developing the homily, that you can share this with me or with others on our staff. And by filling this in, we can give you then feedback on where we think you are, what we think is good, what we think maybe could use some more revision. So this is a way of having you organize your thinking and your ideas, and to be able to collaborate together, and also a way of perhaps receiving feedback on without having to get way too far down the line. This is like a place to start to receive feedback, so we can see like how we're doing before we get into the too much of the details. So talking about each of these elements. So the me, this is where the first part of the talk, where we establish common ground. We're going to build relationships. We're going to orient the assembly. We're going to get them to have you know them better. It's important to be authentic, really, to be vulnerable, to show that you're a human being here. So that's this idea of preaching from weakness. This at St. Raphael, this is really important. If you think about it, there are 4 priests and 4 deacons. Many of you are only preaching at each Mass, maybe like once a month, if that. If we have a lot of people that don't come to Mass every single week. In fact, most people are not coming to Mass every single week. There probably are a lot of people are only coming to Mass once a month, or once every other week, or something like that, twice a month. So the chances of them encountering you, you think about it over the course of the year, they may only see each of you 3, 4, 5 times, and the fact is you're all wearing the same clothes, so you're wearing vestments, so they see the guys in green or in purple, and you kind of just all distinguishing between each of you is can be challenging. The point is that they don't actually know you as well as you might think they do. There's that core group, a few hundred, that are there all the time and that are really active. And of course, they know who you are better. They see you more often. But there's probably, for the vast majority of the people that are there, the 3,000 people that are here at St. Raphael every weekend, they don't really know much about you. They don't know who you are. And even over a few years, you don't really have a chance to establish any type of relationship ongoing. So that's why it's important at the beginning of each talk that you establish this common ground, that you work on building a relationship. In the book Made to Stick that we talked about, this is where you're establishing credibility, and there's techniques in that book that you can use to establish credibility. So it's important. It can vary where you are. How much time you need to spend on this can change. But so, for instance, maybe at a daily Mass, most of those people are there almost every day, and they know who you are. You don't have to spend much time sort of building that relationship before you get to the point. But on a weekend, you need to spend time and energy on building that common ground, and you need to figure out how to do that, and how that is where we're going to start by beginning to figure out the tension that you want to talk about. So this building relationship is not unattached with the point. We're going to build it starting with the point that we're going to talk about, or thinking about identifying this tension that we want to talk about, and in doing so from just building some common ground. So the second part is the we. This is where we are going to basically build the tension, and especially thinking about how people are going to react emotionally, and thinking about it as trying to appeal to a broad an audience as possible. So thinking about how we can ask a question that will apply to as many people as possible. We'll talk about this more, but the fact is that people are not going to care for the most part, with some exceptions, they're not going to care about what you want to share with them. You have to figure out how to make them care. That means that you have to build and create this tension, and you can show that it's with the we part is that you show that it's relevant to all of us, right? It's a question that you're asking, and it's a question that they should ask. And you're going to just ask the question and build that tension up as much as possible until the listener just is dying from the fact that you have not answered the question. That this is finding the struggle, or sometimes it's like it's the burden. It's that thing you just have to that thing you want to communicate, that you're just going to build that question to. It's key not to answer the question. Often when I hear about a homily, we'll hear a story like the road to Emmaus or something, and the beginning of the homily is something about, like, now we're going to hear how Jesus reveals himself. Now we're going to talk about how Jesus reveals himself to us, even though sometimes he's hidden, just as he revealed himself to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. So you just gave away the point, or the whole thing that you were working. And so nobody's gonna, if you give the answer away at the beginning, nobody's gonna listen to the rest of the talk, because they already received the answers. So the idea here is we think about it more as a mystery, or a narrative, where we're going to ask a question, and we're going to sort of explore that question and build it up. Why do we need to learn? What's behind this question that we just have to get this answer to? So then the third section is the God part, and this is sort of the smallest here on the outline, but it's often probably the most amount of material. So this is where we are able to resolve at least some of this tension now by pointing people to what God thinks about, or what God has said about, on whatever this question that we've brought up. So we're going to go to the scriptures here, and primarily, but also you can think about using, since we're in the context of liturgy, we can also use liturgical text like prayers, like the collect or the preface, or we can use other things that happen in the liturgy, the flow of the symbolism, or the liturgical season. Or this is also where we can bring in saints, so like Saint Ignatius said this, or Saint Augustine said this. So we can bring in the riches of our tradition, and how our tradition answers some of these this tension that we've brought up. And you're maybe not going to just do it in one way. You're going to take multiple examples of scripture, or an example of scripture, an example of something a saint or a holy person said, and then an example of something that happens in the liturgy. So you're going to reinforce that, and so they're answering the question along the same lines. And so this is where we're going to just share the church's wisdom here as it answers this question. And by now we've built up that tension so that people are looking for these answers, and looking to, are interested in seeing how what God has to say through scriptures and tradition is going to help them answer this question that you spent so much time building up in their minds is important. So the fourth part, the you. So this is having sort of figured out what God teaches us and says about this. Then you have to ask, though, like, but so what? So the people, this is what God says, but what are we going to actually do about it? Um, so now what are we going to do? And this is where you're going to propose some sort of challenge that everybody can embrace. It's something maybe they can try for a week or a day, some sort of small change. Um, it's important to, especially in the context of what we're trying to do, especially at St. Raphael, is being missionary and really looking not just at serving the people that are already committed and faithful, but looking at, starting at the core, but then looking at all people at all different levels and experiences. It's important that whatever we think about, we try to include as many people as possible in this possibility. So how does this apply to um, to the people? With what I'm asking, how does it apply to all the people here, whether or not, wherever they are in their at their stage of belief or unbelief, and whatever they are on their faith journey? We've had experiences in Alpha, so we have hopefully started, and we've been all like sort of interacting more with people at different levels of their faith journey, and so we should know how and think about how what we're going to ask could be received by them. Even cooler, you can ask about those who aren't there. It can be a challenge for the people to share with the people that aren't there. So we're just trying to cast like this huge net, uh, and just try to make it something like feasible, and it needs to it's going to relate, but it's not so big that it's just that it seems impossible. It's just a one small step to get us to the next level. Basically, that's the one small little change that we're trying to go for, that is going to make a big difference. And then finally we get to the we, and this is where we cast a vision. So at the end we say, like, imagine if we all just did this one little thing. Imagine if you can think about this. Sometimes it's really cool to tie this into things that are actually happening at the parish. Like, we've just had these food drives in the last couple of months. Like, imagine if everybody who was able brought in a donation, a grocery bag, or a financial donation, and next weekend to support Catholic parish outreach. Imagine if we all did this together, what we could do to transform like the lives of others and our community and our relationships. Imagine if each of us this week went and called that one person that really needed, that we needed to apologize to. Like, if we all did that, that's 3,000 relationships that are transformed, right? Imagine if we all prayed and invited somebody. So you talk about this is this a thing, and we can say, like, how is it going to transform our personal lives? How could it transform our parish community, like our general community in Raleigh, or even our whole world? Like, so this is where we can really like cast that vision of what this change, which comes from what God gives us based on this big question that we've answered, like, what will it look like? And so it can get quite beautiful here. So that's the me, we, God, you, we way. And you can see how this is structured, not around the content that we're talking about, but this is structured around sharing the message, and this progression of taking people on a journey, to to communicate this one point that we have. Okay, the next part of this are more suggestions for delivering and constructing. So number 4 is internalizing the message. So Andy Stanley makes this very has this challenge for us that give deliver messages, that preach, is that if you aren't able to deliver the message from your heart, like if you don't know it well enough that you can't stand in front of everybody without a couple pages of it written out, and you can't follow it well enough because you don't know it and haven't internalized it, how are you going to expect the listeners to get anything out of that? And like if you can't, how are those that are gathered are going to remember anything that you said if you can't even remember what you said, right? So the idea here is to reduce the message down to 5 or 6 pieces or sections of information. So it could be some things that Andy Stanley does is you could have prompts for each of these sections that prompt you, so you just remember what you're going to talk about here. So that's helpful. Having that main idea that you want to say, so that sticky phrase that you're going to use, you want to use that and say it the same way every time. So that is something you're going to want to have in front of you. And when we're talking about this, it's maybe having a card or just something that you can carry or hold. Or if you have I know Father Phil, for instance, uses a Magnificat book, and will have a note card in there. You might have the Bible or something like that, a book. Or you can just have a card or something if you need, but it has that thing that you're going to, that message, that sticky message, and then it's going to have any other information you need on it. It could have these prompts for these sections. If you're going to go through scriptures and you want to go back and quote scriptures, then that's something you probably want to have written down or be able to reference in the Magnificat or in the Bible, or if you're going to go back and use the lectionary. But you're going to want to quote that. So having that in front of you would be important. But besides that, you should be able to do and communicate your message without having it all written out. And remember, if you realize when you're going through this, if it doesn't advance the message, then you need to get rid of it. So everything that you're saying is driving forward this one point. All right, number 5 is engaging your audience. And if you look on the homily form that I've made, it has the sections for the different elements, the me, for the me, we, God, you, and we. And at the end, I ask this question: what techniques are you going to engage the assembly? So that's where we think about these things. And these are just some practical suggestions. The Made to Stick book that we looked at last year has some of these, and then has all kinds of other ideas of ways that we can engage and make the message more memorable. So first, this idea that attention and retention is determined by presentation. So sometimes the content is so interesting to people that the presentation doesn't really matter. So so sometimes we've had these sort of scandals, or something happens and everybody knows that the homilist has to address it, right? And so and it's already of extreme interest to everybody, and so you already have their attention, and no matter what you say or how you say it, you have their attention already. But that, for the most part, 99% of the time is not the case. The fact is that you have to think about your presentation and how interesting that is to people is based on how you present it. It's not based on the message. The people do not care about what you want to share with them. It's not really of interest to them until you create the reasons why. This is not made up. This is just where you're going through and asking these questions they haven't maybe thought of before, and you really have to drive that home. And you have to think about how you present things is really important to driving attention and retention. Um, so you can say that presentation can take a backseat to information when you convince the assembly you're about to answer a mystery they have been unable to solve. So that can be something that they haven't, that everybody's asking that question. And then presentation might not be as important because you already have their interest. But most of the time, you're going to have to, letter C, manufacture the interest because no one cares to hear an answer to a question no one is asking. And chances are the question that you're going to be asking, most of the people haven't thought to ask yet. And so you have to figure out how to build that and make that relevant for them. Thinking about what is that question I'm answering? What is this tension? Like, what does this message solve? So thinking about that. Then some more practical suggestions. Don't go too fast, right? So slow down, always good. And especially slow down in the curves and these transitions between sections. Think about where you're transitioning from one place to another. People, when you're changing directions and going, you really have to be careful to figure out how you're going to take people along from one section to the next. It has to make sense. If you're going to reread a text, like a gospel story, think through how you're going to navigate through that text. So if you're just going to read, what lines are you going to read? Which grouping of verses are you going to read? And then before commenting on them, and think through that clearly, like how you're going to reread through that so that it makes sense if you're going to choose that approach. So always good to add a surprise or something unexpected to challenge an assumption. That's huge in Made to Stick. This idea of breaking something like that everybody just assumes is the way, and it turns out it's completely not true. That gets people's attention. And so if you can find something that says something, the church, often people like everybody assumes the church teaches something. And it's just so clear cut, and you can just say, actually, this is the church says this, and it sometimes is very different than what people think, and that gets their attention, and you can use that to build on. So some sort of surprise or unexpected, but then also take a direct route. So Andy Stanley says that in some cases you can use this technique of sort of keeping your audience in the dark and keeping them a little off balance. You can use that technique and it can be effective. But he says really only the very most talented communicators are able to hold that together. He suggests for most of us, mortals at least, taking the most direct route. So that means like that your audience can tell and see the direction that you're going, and you're not zigzagging around or making tangents. So you're going from here to here to here, and it's clear where you're going, and you're not asking them to go out too far on a limb with you, right? You're just going right here to here to here, and it's clear where you're going. Otherwise, if you're not able to sort of hold that tension of sort of going in an abstract, sort of unclear direction, if you're not careful, then you can really you'll lose their attention and make them frustrated, and you'll just lose the audience there because they're not gonna follow you. And so it's just safer and more often than not better to take a clear, direct route from point A to point B to show where you're going. Okay, number 6 is to find your voice. So often I've heard priests or other preachers, deacons say, well, I just don't have that gift of tickling the ears like so-and-so does. So, and the connotation is that, well, therefore I'm can just be satisfied with not being very good at giving homily, and I don't. And not only that, I'm not even going to work on it, because it's just all 100% a gift of the Holy Spirit that's just bestowed upon somebody, and either you got it or you don't. And if you don't, then there's no reason to work on it. And what we're saying here is that's not the case at all. So being yourself is not an excuse for poor communication habits. You should try to become the best communicator that you can be. And not everybody, obviously, some people have a very natural ability to communicate and to speak, and most of us don't have that. But we can certainly work on being better at it, and treat it rather than just, we can treat it as a craft that we can work on and something that we can get better at. He suggests just asking what works, like, and to think about, like, what works and what am I capable of and what works for me in particular. I think you have to be real and, like, authentic. You can't be something that you're not. You can't go up there and pretend to be something that you're not. So you have to find something that works for you, and that can take some time and some work to find what really works. Finally, number 7 is just like when you've gone through this entire thing and you realize it's Saturday night and you're giving a homily on Sunday morning and you got nothing, and it's just like it's all everything you've worked on, and you realize it's just not going to work. And this is where he says you're gonna basically start all over. So it's kind of going back to the basics. So he says this: don't allow the pressure to get the sermon finished to override passion to bring something fresh to the assembly. So I think this is where he's giving you permission to start over, again, and don't just finish something that you've been working on when you know that it's not good. Like, you need to take the time to go back and look at it again. So when you're stuck, pray. So prayer hopefully enters into all this at some point, but this is a clear place where, when we're stuck, we need to stop and we need to pray. And then last, it's just go back to basics. So, we need to ask these questions that we already tried to ask, but now we need to go back and ask them again. What do they need to know? Why do they need to know it? What do they need to do? Why do they need to do it? And how can I help them remember? That's really the basics. This is the what and what we're communicating, and then how can I do it in a way that will help everybody remember what I have to say. So that is this method of 1-point preaching that we're going to give a try, at least in Advent. As I said, if you want to, you can work on filling out this form with these prompts, and then as a means for getting feedback on how we're doing. And we'll use this when we work in groups as well, as a way to kind of have everybody focused. So thanks so much for your attention, and thanks for your ministry. Whatever your level is as a communicator, the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you have your own authentic gifts to share, and it's just our job to continue to work on them and hone them and get better and better for God's glory, and certainly for the good of all the people. Thank you.